as we proceed, we're going to learn a lot about different land use tools and techniques. Again, I'm sure that many of you have heard of several of them. I'm just adjusting a few things here to make this a little bit easier. Okay. But as we go through here, you know, you can tell me that you're already doing these things or that you would like to know more about them. So again, to go back to where we were in our little introduction to what we might do today, you know that both the town board and the village board of trustees have been given the authority under state law to adopt comprehensive plans. And in that authority, in the law itself, the state suggests that you adopt a comprehensive plan, but doesn't require it. Suggests that you review it periodically, but doesn't require you to do that either. And it contains 15 different components that you might consider putting in your comprehensive plan. And it definitely includes anything dealing with public health, drinking water, water quantity, water quality. Components of comprehensive plans can be created to go with each of those different 15 ideas that the state law includes. There are a variety of ways in which comprehensive plans can be amended, either directly by the town or village board or through the planning board. The planning board can formulate the plan, or a special group can be put together to come up with amendments to the comprehensive plan. The law suggests but doesn't require a lot of public education and input. We really emphasize education and input because given how busy everyone's lives are, it's very difficult to get the public educated. But if you're doing something significant like amending the comprehensive plan or coming up with a critical issue component of a comprehensive plan, you can get the public to come to meetings, particularly now that we can do them virtually. And you can get input, and you can learn from people who live next to polluting development or next to critical water resources, what's going on. And you can also let them know that there's a lot of things that villages and towns can do that educates them about local government and builds a constituency. I remember one time calling a friend of mine who was a supervisor of a northern town in Westchester County, who had publicly stated he wasn't going to follow the comprehensive plan. And I asked him, I said, why did you make that statement? You're somebody who really does support land use planning and land use regulation that's responsible. And he said, well, because it's not my plan. He said, it's not the people's plan. The people had nothing to do with it. It was put together by a consultant and adopted one night by the town board. And I don't think it reflects the reality of the facts on the ground. And it certainly doesn't reflect the feelings and ideas of the people that are in power right now. So unless you use the comprehensive planning process to build a constituency for good ideas, it kind of begs the question of how do you get a constituency developed that will stick with comprehensive planning and stick with the implementation techniques and support them when they get adopted. It's a big way to build a constituency. And then critically, from a legal perspective, if you can show that a regulation of the village or the town accomplishes a provision of the comprehensive plan, you win all kinds of lawsuits. That keeps them from being violations of due process, being violative of the Equal Protection Clause, keeps them from being beyond your authority, ultra vires. There's all kinds of legal protection that comes from having comprehensive plan components that back up and support the actual land use regulations that you adopt. And those land use regulations in New York State, as well as zoning, must conform to the plan. And I recognize the mayor's comments about that issue and suppose that you're going to get away with most of what you want to do under your current plans. But if you do adopt new ideas, new techniques, it's good to be able to tether them to something in the comprehensive plan, an objective and implementation technique that you've adopted in a component of the comprehensive plan. And I'm looking and asking Jenny and Hannah to help me look for raised hands. So far, crickets.
No hands so far.
Okay. So now we get down to protecting water quality and watersheds. So in the power to zone, you all know that you create zoning districts and limit land uses and create dimensional standards within those districts, but zoning can create large lots, for example, to prevent groundwater pollution from on-site wastewater systems. That's kind of engineering 101. And then there are various ways that you can use your zoning authority and your standards within your zoning code. This would be part of what you would inventory, going back to what the mayor was talking about, looking at our code and what does it do. When you look at it, the maximum lot coverage, what that means is how much impervious coverage you can put on a lot. Look at the lot size and the lot coverage. You can determine for that particular lot, that 1 acre, 2 acre lot, whatever it is, how much impervious coverage you are allowing. But unless you do that on a watershed basis or a neighborhood basis, it's hard to know how much impervious coverage you're allowing. And there are ecosystem service experts who like to keep impervious coverage below certain standards, and you have the ability to do that through your zoning, and you can prevent hazardous land wastes from locating near source water. We helped a town of Dover years ago in Dutchess County to become one of the first communities to adopt an overlay zone over its aquifer. And the whole point was to keep hazardous land uses from locating above that sole source groundwater, drinking water, groundwater, through zoning, the adoption of a aquifer protection zone. And then through zoning, you can allow for the imposition of conditions on requests to rezone to protect source water. So if somebody wants to come to the village board or the town board and say, I want my property rezoned, and I don't think it would be illegal spot zoning, you can say, okay, we'll consider it, but you're going to have potential impacts, negative impacts on the water systems. And we're going to impose very specific conditions on your request for rezoning to keep that from happening. Hand raised, check.
No hands.
Not yet. Okay. Some of you may know the name Mike Clemens. Mike Clemens worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society and was on the Planning Commission in the city of Rye in Westchester County, and he was a renowned herpetologist. And he said, I want to have the Wildlife Conservation Society fund a training program in a watershed in Westchester, northern Westchester. And what I want to do is to have you guys figure out the answers to certain questions. Like, for example, there's this trough of death that we recognize when you put in curbs that are 90-degree angles, then the turtles crawl into the road and they can't get up the other side, and they go down and find the storm drain and they end up in there. And we call that the trough of death. Is there anything that you can do with land use authority to keep that from happening? And I said, sure, you can amend the site plan and subdivision regulations to bevel the curbs, give the turtles a way out. And really, some of the land use solutions are quite straightforward and simple when you think about it. It's just people don't really recognize that something as opaque and little understood by the average person as a subdivision regulation or a site plan regulation can really do that kind of work at the local level. But you can, under state law, you can cluster the lots allowed in a subdivision, take them away from places where they would negatively impact water quality. You can adopt riparian buffers. You can impose, as you must if you're an MS4, stormwater management measures. You can require spacing of septics and well placement. You can impose conditions on development through the subdivision site plan regulation process and prohibit hazardous uses and applications near source waters.
Hey, John, this is Russell. As you know, after Dover created its aquifer protection ordinance, time passed, and then we worked with Dutchess County government to create a model ordinance that a number of other towns have adopted, which pick up on many of those same concepts, as well as tuck into that water resource protection code section some of the things you've just discussed in terms of cluster subdivision guidance, stormwater guidance, septic density guidance. It's all in now the zoning, for example, for Amenia, Pleasant Valley, Phillipstown. So there's a model ordinance that could be circulated for consideration.
Are you looking at the screen, Russell?
Oh, look at that. Good for you.
Here, the second slide is the one that I think is so interesting, and I'd like you to just take as much time as possible. Let me set the stage for what Russell's about to say. We haven't talked yet about special use permits, but certain types of land development can be called special uses, and they can be subject to special use permits. And that allows you to set up special standards designed to control those particular activities. So Pine Plains, for example, has a zoning code that requires a special use permit for certain logging activities and additional permits for stream and wetland disturbances. What Russell did, and I'd like to have him tell the story, is he took that special use permit authority and turned it into an amazing model ordinance that he just described, and I'd like him to slow down and do it again. And I tried to put some of the more interesting parts of it in this second slide, but maybe, Russell, we could take people's eyes off the slide and just listen to your story.
And we have a raised hand maybe before we transition.
Speak up.
Hi, this is Neil. I guess it's a question for either you or Russell about, you mentioned stormwater development, and maybe just some background for me, because I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I'm wondering, when people are applying for like a site plan approval, is every one of those like kind of treated separately and like its own little, you have to control a stormwater runoff from that parcel, or do you ever start stepping back and looking at like all of the development in, so that maybe say that whole sewer shed, and start looking at the cumulative amount of impervious surface? Or, can you do that, or would that even make sense?
I'll just mention
seems
one
like
thing and turn it over to Russell if he'd like to follow up on. The town of New Paltz is a MS4. You have a separate storm system.
Yes, we are.
Sewage system. And that the effluent goes into whatever water body it goes into is considered a point source of pollution. So you're regulated under speedies, and to get that permit from the state, you have to do things comprehensively, to answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I worry that a lot of the way we plan and make rules is kind of very individually based by each application or parcel, and that you end up with death by 1,000 cuts. And that we don't step back and kind of, yes, it's, say 10% is the amount of impervious surface that we don't want to get above. And so this one parcel may just make it 5%, but then, there are other places that we know are going to be to make it worse. That's kind of what I'm looking. Can we look at it holistically, or does everything has to be based on each application and parcel?
Well, as you do those critical environmental areas, you can put a lot of effort into that analysis and be sure that the environmental impact analysis of each individual site is compared to that overall context. Russell, do you want to help me out here? I'm getting tired of hearing myself talk.
Well, I don't have much to add to this because I'm a hydrogeologist, but on the stormwater side, and maybe Dan Kendall or Sue Van Patten would have something to punch in on this one, but I've seen the estuary program provide grants to communities to do some holistic stormwater modeling for an entire hillside area or some such. Because to Neil's point, zoning is usually practiced on the parcel by parcel or project by project basis. And so to get that holistic view is a challenge. It takes a higher look, and it's often not funded or doesn't have a good tool or can't be charged back to a particular applicant in a clear and transparent way. I will use this moment to get on one of my little soapboxes. I take a contrarian view to undersized culverts. I think undersized culverts are our best built infrastructure against downstream flooding. And the current urge to upgrade all culverts only exacerbates downstream flooding. And I would instead advocate for armoring and better design for undersized culverts because I think they actually do an awful lot of good in our landscape at the moment.
And that points us in the direction of on-site protections and retention and detention and.
Exactly. Every undersized culvert is a built detention structure unless it's creates an undue hazard for one reason or another. But Neil's point is valid, which is who takes the holistic view. Watershed source water protection programs are looking at the holistic view so that we don't have a stormwater analog for that is perhaps needed. And once again, don't know whether Dan or Sue Van Patten have something to add.
Sue actually has her hand raised. So Sue, you want to go for it?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sue Van Patten. I work for DEC in the Division of Water. We do have watershed planning tools. If the water body is impaired, the state could do a total maximum daily load, which is a watershed planning tool. It's a very long process. I think, though, often what is a better path to go down is for a community to look at the 9-element plan, process. Department of State does fund some of the elements for that watershed planning process. It's an EPA process, and it's outlined on the DEC website. I can put the link in the chat. And if you have questions about doing a 9-element plan, you're interested, you're thinking about it, I recommend that you email us and talk about it with us ahead of time. That's even though there's information on the website, it's always better to kind of talk it through with the community so that everybody's on the same page. So as the community moves through that process, they are aware of what needs to be done. And even before you start, like kind of what the game plan is and what the road is that you'll have to go down. It involves, modeling and things like that. And like I said, Department of State often does provide some funding for that. And then in terms of implementation, then, once you've done something like that and identified the areas and the implementation activities, then that does open the door for you to have more points when the implementation project comes in as a WQIP application. So the tools are out there. We're happy to help people and talk with people about it. Like I said, I'll put the link in the chat and feel free to get in touch with us if you have more questions or want to explore that option. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I'm glad you're on. Russell, I am personally extraordinarily impressed with my second paragraph here, which is taken from Jenny's analysis of your model ordinance. But this is magic as far as I'm concerned. You take a special use permit, you require. You look at what I've got here. The whole idea of figuring out how much water is going to be needed and what's going to happen to that water and how much negative impact is going to be and whether or not this is a kind of thing. I don't want to speak anymore. I want you to describe this again. It's really a great program.
Thanks, John. The model ordinance that and where credit is due is to Dutchess County for having funded our work. Dutchess County Planning Department, that pays us to manage a groundwater monitoring program across Dutchess County, has paid to do recharge rate studies and paid to develop a model ordinance. And those are now available documents for everybody. What we were able to do once we identified aquifer recharge rates is when you have that information, you can do project site by project site analysis on whether a project is sustainable or self-supporting, which is not a requirement, but is a useful piece of information for as you go through the seeker process and can help you understand whether there may or may not be offsite impacts. So we can look at a 50-acre parcel, for example, understand what the typical recharge rates will be, and then calculate the water uses that are proposed for that parcel, not just the pumping rates, but more importantly, probably the consumptive water uses, which are usually just a fraction of the pumped water, and then determine whether there's enough recharge on site to support the consumptive uses. And then if on-site wastewater disposal is planned back to the ground with septic systems, the model looks at some standard factors for nitrate loading, and once again determines whether the parcel is large enough that the aggregate recharge will bring the nitrate loading below thresholds such that we can consider it able to, in a sense, digest its own wastewater without offsite impacts. And so baking that into the model ordinance provides information to the planning board to determine whether a project requires higher scrutiny or can just be moved ahead because it in a sense is really sustainable both on the consumptive side and on the wastewater processing side to proceed without further inquiry. So that's a pretty neat part of this ordinance. It's pretty detailed. Sometimes when we introduce it to a community, they turn a little pale at first and say, wow, that's complicated. But I've seen communities use it and become increasingly comfortable with it. That's just one element of this model ordinance. It also has guidance for how to lay out a cluster subdivision, which these days I think are called conservation subdivisions. It has a section that I think could be removed on stormwater management because much of the ordinance was drafted before the state's latest update of the stormwater regs. And so some of the things that are in the model ordinance, I think are superseded by the latest stormwater elements. And it certainly has, as I think John was about to talk about, some special use permit elements where you kind of get one crack at the apple when a new project comes in. But if you can ask that applicant to demonstrate to them, to the town, the measures they're taking for secondary containment or some such things like that, and to commit to some periodic feedback back to the town, this is the time to get that commitment. So those are some of the elements of the ordinance. It is adopted on a townwide basis. And so another element of the model ordinance is to distinguish between the recharge areas for significant well fields, in other words, something analogous to the DWSP2 program. And those areas are proposed, or in the model ordinance, receive a higher level of source water recharge area protection. And then areas that are not in those recharge areas are nonetheless critical resources to people who use domestic wells. And some measure of protection is warranted for the rest of the landscape. And so this ordinance provides a lesser but targeted set of protection elements for the balance of the town that relies on domestic wells. That's my pitch, John, and my introduction.
So if you want to live an exciting life, you marry a hydrologist and move to Dutchess County.
You know, I could go on for hours and hours on this. But and it's why it's such a pleasure to be involved with the DWSP2 program, because this is an evolution of many of those thoughts. Although the DWSP2 program is focused only on the community water system wells, whereas this model ordinance provides a town-wide protection that, as I just said, provides a higher level of protection for what is the analogous DWSP2 project areas, and a lesser level of protection for the more distributed domestic well parts of the landscape.
Well, now that we've added you, I've got a couple of hydrological questions to ask about other things that we're going to go through. So don't go to sleep on me.
No, I will remind you that I need to leave at 11.
Okay. Won't let that happen without talking about clustering in your presence. Are there any comments or questions about this model ordinance that Russell just described?
Available for free. I can send copies to anybody. It's paid for. Various towns have adopted it. Various towns have not been sued over it, which should be reassuring to municipal officials. I was a town board member once in Hyde Park. I know what the zoning and the comprehensive plan battles can be. Here we are.
Just as a side issue, if there's nothing that interests Jenny and me more, having just finished teaching this topic in our land use class at Pace Law School, than regulatory takings and property rights. So if incidental to any of these questions that raises in your mind, we were called into one watershed to spend an entire night explaining whether or not their watershed regulations were going to create liability for regulatory takings and require compensation for taking away property rights. It's something that we're prepared to talk about on a moment's notice, just like Russell can talk about hydrology on a moment's notice. So if there are any hands that want to be raised at any point about that topic, Jenny and I are here. So again, thank you, Russell.
Sure.
Well, let's work this backwards since we're on it. The town and village law in the state of New York, subdivision law. Let me back up. Much to your chagrin, the village and town have no inherent legal authority. You're not sovereign entities given birth with legal authority. Even home rule is limited by things that are of state interest, and the state legislature can take back, like they did in the Adirondacks, they can take back your land use authority if it's in the state interest to do so. So you get your authority for everything that you do through the New York State Constitution, the New York State Legislature, and the legislature has adopted laws that allow you to subdivide land, to regulate the subdivision of land. And in doing that, they basically figure you're going to do a cookie cutter subdivision using your zoning lot sizes and some other environmental indicators, and come up with a lot count of maybe 60, 70 units on that 100-acre parcel that Russell was talking about. And then you're going to lay them all out in individual lots, cover the entire 100 acres with individually owned lots, and put a house on them and driveways and other things that are going to cause impervious coverage. So doing it that way doesn't really allow you to protect the hydrological functions, for example, to mention that, of the site, the overall site. But it does allow you to take those things into consideration, because what you can do under cluster subdivision is to require, you have to, the town board and the village board of trustees have to authorize your planning board to do this. But if they do, and they say it must be mandatory, then the planning board can require developers to put all of their 60 units or 70 units on 50% of the site, or 30% of the site, or 60% of the site. And in making decisions about where to put the houses and the driveways and the impervious coverage, you can respect the hydrological considerations and other considerations, the ecosystem services of the site. So you can do, really, the New York State cluster subdivision law is extraordinarily ambitious. It allows you to create multifamily housing in single family zones. You can do really tight clusters. You can permit less development of open space. You can identify critical environmental areas, what you've already done or are doing in the town, and you can keep the development of the site away from those areas. So it allows, for example, planning boards to prevent development near streams and other vulnerable parts of the parcel. with that, I don't know, Russell, if you'd like to add maybe a couple of case examples or thoughts that you have on clustering.
This is also a good conversation for Tim Rose, Ulster County Health Department, to jump in on. But you know, all the good intentions of cluster subdivision are to preserve open space and woodlands and critical habitats, but they create all the complications of clustering logistically. And so you have wells and wastewater functions jammed together in one corner of a parcel. And many people have tried to untie this knot of complication. Community septic comes into play, but then you get very small groups of people needing to maintain collective infrastructure that in X years needs maintenance that they collectively can't fund or can't agree to fund, and then you get nightmares. So everybody tiptoes into the logistics of cluster subdivision carefully. Sticking with my own discipline, the groundwater supply side, our model ordinance at least provides some suggestions for looking to try to keep a cluster subdivision on private infrastructure by looking at directions of groundwater flow. If groundwater, you can count on groundwater flow moving from high to low because water underground does it on the surface. And so if you have an option to lay out a conservation subdivision with wells all on the uphill side and septics all on the downhill side, you have a potential to for a cluster subdivision to be able to advance on individual services, which just leaves maintenance up to the individual property owners. That's not always possible, but that is the guidance that's in the model ordinance. And it's interesting how many cluster subdivisions you see where just because of the parcel or just because of some other asset or resource, you see the 8 or 10 houses laid out exactly up to downhill, right in line with each other, which just means that the wastewater from one flows right to the well of the next. And if this cluster subdivision could be laid out perpendicular to the slope rather than vertical to the slope, or across the slope rather than up and down the hill, you could just alleviate that problem. So that is the extent of what's in the model ordinance that relates to cluster subdivision. The rest of it is a higher level complication that I think Tim or others could probably weigh in on.
And when
Yeah,
you're
Russell, I would just like to say, I agree with what you said, especially about the maintenance when it comes into community water supplies or community wastewater systems. A lot of times we run into this quite often where there's either a homeowners association that's involved and there are volunteers that are trying to run the system and the finances just aren't there, or you have a small water system might be owned by a private water company that takes care of it, and sometimes those individuals may walk away, and it is long term. There are large headaches for us. I can tell you that we deal with that. Whereas if a municipality owns it, we never have issues with the municipalities. They're just always run so well, and they have the financial backing and so forth. But on some of these smaller systems, these cluster type developments, can be a long-term issue and headache for us, quite frankly.
So this is why in the model ordinance, our groundwater-based recommendation was, please consider the option of creating perhaps a series of littler clusters as opposed to one big cluster. Because if you have 5 or 6 houses in sort of one node on a piece of property, you may be able to lay out individual wells and septics in an up gradient, down gradient relationship that will allow them to proceed as if they're individual, while also satisfying the cluster objectives of majority open space protection. So series of smaller clusters, uphill to downhill relationships, those are the groundwater guidance tools that one could use to get around the nightmare scenario that Tim wrestles with underfunded HOAs that just can't make it work.
And quite frankly, in some of these situations, it really puts the town in a bad position too, because I know of several in the county that are going on right now where the residents are really asking for the town to take over some of these systems. And, the town doesn't want a headache as well. And I get that. I understand. And each situation is unique. I don't want to be general, overgeneralize too much. But it does put the town in a difficult position. And I understand that. So, I just want to make sure we make note of that.
I've probably been hearing about this not in the cluster subdivision world for 30 years. And I kind of understood it 30 years ago. Hasn't there been significant enough improvement in community systems that this has become a little bit less of a tied up knot, or am I just making that up?
Well, the few situations I can think of in Ulster County, they tend to be privately owned water systems with some, in a couple of cases, absentee landlords who just don't want to put the money into it. They try to put the system up for sale. But when you're talking $1 million, $2 million of work that needs to be done, the fear is, and it hasn't happened yet, at least not recently, that some of these owners are just going to say, we're just going to walk away. And whatever happens, happens. And these homes, a lot of these homes are built so close together, there's no way to put individual wells.
I guess my question is for new development. Are there community systems now that have evolved technologically so that it's not quite as tight as it used to be 30 years ago?
Well, I can tell you from my experience, it's not so much the technology as it is more the financial backing and the maintenance. That's the issue that we grapple with. When you need to lay out several $100,000, let's say, for some maintenance costs, especially if it's I can think of one that's a homeowners association that we're dealing with now, and some of the people are walking away. They don't want to deal with it. Who has the finances? Where are the finances to operate these systems? Those sort of things. It's the overall management of the system that we grapple with constantly.
So the relevance of this, if we go back to Russell's point about small clusters and uphill, downhill gradient approaches, does mute the ability of clustering to move development away from surface waters, for example, to a certain degree, but it still allows you some flexibility. The idea behind clustering was that it was to promote open space, but then all types of ecological services. And so a lot of the wetlands preservation, the buffer creation that you do with clustering might be muted somewhat by having to do the small cluster approach, the combination of small cluster approaches. But this is a knot that's been tied tight through literally 3 decades, and we'll keep working at it.
John, I think that anybody who's messed around with septic systems and wells for very long realizes that the typical homeowner barely understands how to maintain those. And if people always say, well, how come I can't do cluster subdivisions and give everybody a composting toilet, or give everybody an additional treatment unit within their septic system so the nitrates and other things are partially digested before reinsertion in the ground. And I think anybody on the regulatory or the maintenance side kind of shudders and says, gosh, if people can't even remember to pump their septic tanks once every X years, how are they going to maintain little tweaky systems like that, let alone pay for them, let alone how are you going to check and make sure that they're working and they're not just quietly not working in some neighborhood because no one's checking. It just backs into a lot of complications. So I don't think the knot has really been untied.
Thank you for that, Russell. I agree. It's a tool that we're going to have to use conservatively for sure. The people that are, Jenny and Hannah, you're checking hands that are raised. Could you check to see if anybody is asleep? Just kidding.
You've managed to keep everyone awake so far.
I think at this point, I'm going to jump off. Thanks, everybody, for your time this morning. And I'm happy to send the ordinance to anybody who wants it and answer any other questions. And I apologize that I need to leave.
Wait.
Thank
can't-
you, Russell. I did put my name and address in there for you to send it to.
Yep, and I think you know how to email me directly, right? Or Tim can certainly give you that. Tim,
I'm sure I can get it from Tim.
exactly, Tim, the mayor. So many Tims. Thank you all.
Well, I'm sorry to see you go, Russell, because now if anybody goes to sleep, it's my fault, not yours.
Send them to Nebraska.
Thank you so much for being with us. It's good to work with you as always.
Pleasure. Bye.
Okay. Now, talking about a topic that we could spend the entire rest of the session on, let's turn to the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Would anybody from the town or village like to talk a little bit about the extent to which seeker has been helpful or a complication for you, so that we could get the background of your two municipalities before we head off in this direction or that on this topic? Anybody who's been on a zoning board or a planning board or the town or village board of trustees has been a lead agency under SECRA, and you've probably had some experiences. If you'd like to share them, is it well utilized? Are you super expert on it? Do you have, Stan, I see you said you were a member of the planning board for years. Do you want to?
And yeah, Tim was before me, Tim Rogers, that is. You know, I've been through it. I would definitely say I am not expert. We always had our attorneys help lead us through it. I think what concerns me about it is sometimes projects, like one of the things that led to me, well, actually the thing that led me to end up on the planning board was me commenting on a big project that was being proposed and showing up on the regular to talk about it. And the planning board before me voted it inexplicably, like I cannot understand how they did that, that there were no impacts and they didn't have to do a full EIS, which, you know, I will never understand. And so that is a concern for me, is that whoever is on the planning board at the time may or may not, you know, they may have different ways of interpreting things, and they think that things aren't significant impacts when many other people clearly see them as being significant impacts. And many of us, I think, are concerned about that. So while I find SECR very useful and helpful, it's also, I think, difficult for many people to, you know, wrap their heads around. When you're in it, it's, you know, it's one thing, but when you're watching it from the outside, it's another. And so I am grateful for SECR, but occasionally I wonder about how we can ensure that it's used properly.
Supervisor, did you want to comment?
Sure. So I have not been on the planning board, but I've seen SECR come up all the time. And I think one of my frustrations is that I think people, they don't realize, they don't understand SECR, the public that is commenting, and that it's about mitigating the adverse environmental impacts. Luckily, I can read your slide. They think that this is a way to stop a project they don't like. They treat it just like the the Endangered Species Act. And they're like, oh, well, there must be a spotted owl on this site. You know, you have to give them a negative deck. And that I think that people think that this is how we're going to stop development, instead of making sure that the development does not have adverse environmental impacts. That's just kind of my read on all of it.
I would agree with that. And I don't think, and I also think that some of us don't necessarily want to stop projects, but we do want a full EIS. So
I noticed, I can't remember which one of your communities has a committee dealing with affordable housing. Is there a
Village.
Is it the village? Is there a relationship between how you treat projects under secra and affordability?
I don't believe that there would be any difference in terms of seeker. I mean, the only difference is that we allow for a density bonus if more affordable units are, because right now our village law requires apartment complexes that have more than 10 units for 10% to be affordable. But then there's a density bonus if you have more than just what's required per our local law.
Terrific. One of the good things about seeker, if it's done right, will align with what Stana and Neil are saying, which is that it's to be a balancing between the social and economic benefits of the development and the environmental degradation that can happen. Those are to be balanced. So sometimes the length of time required to get through the State Environmental Quality Review Act process is so time consuming, and taxes are being paid and equity borrowing from banks with the interest is being paid, and it just gets to be so unaffordable after a certain period of time because it's only considered to be seeker an environmental protection device as opposed to a balancing among social, economic, and environmental matters. So I support what you guys have said. Anything else about the State Environmental Quality Review Act? I remember one community we were working in, they were all excited because the neighbors were complaining that the village was having secret meetings, and what they didn't realize they were talking about was meetings about secret, not secret meetings. But it can be very, very fraught. I think that the critical point to make here is that seeker provides a flexible tool that doesn't require any legislation on the part of the village or the town to be sure that water quality is a serious consideration in any development that comes forward. And I'd be happy to describe in detail how that works, but I don't want to bore anybody or lose anybody by going into that detail. But it does require an environmental assessment form to be submitted with all applications for subdivision, site plan, rezoning, special use permits. And in those environmental assessment forms, they have to indicate what the environmental impacts might be of the development. And then those things have to be considered in determining whether or not those impacts are going to be significant. And if so, then there has to be a lengthy process involving an environmental impact statement. There are a dozen ways that you can anticipate those negative impacts during the pre-application review process and the application process itself, where you can comb out some of those negative impacts. So if you have a critical environmental area, for example, and Stan, I think this goes to your point, probably why you support doing all 5 CEAs at once, right? That if you have a critical environmental area, you're allowed to do that, believe it or not, under SECR. That's where you get your authority to adopt critical environmental area. And what that means is that if a development comes forward that is in that critical environmental area are going to have an impact on that critical environmental area, you've got an area-wide analysis that you can look at to determine whether or not this is going to have a negative impact on the environment. So it really heightens the understanding of environmental impact. And when you add to that a natural resource inventory and a conservation board that's advising the planning board, which may or may not be mean, conservation boards, by and large, have environmentally interested and experienced people on them.
Yes, ours is wonderful really wonderful.
And I'm not going to ask you to comment on your planning board, but there are lots of considerations that go into appointing people to the planning board. Environment is only one of them. So you may or may not have environmental expertise in the planning board as such. But if you align your conservation advisory group or your conservation board together with the critical environmental area, together with the advice that they can then give to the planning board in making determinations on their seeker, you've got everything pretty well coordinated. And it gets back to the supervisor's question about how do we see things a little bit more generally, a little bit more geographically broad than just the individual site, because that CEA gives you the broader geographical function. And your CEA can be drawn around hydrological considerations or any other considerations. And they can function as an overlay zone. So there's a lot that you can do with these things, but I don't want to go into any of the details unless you guys want me to discuss these things further. Are there any specific questions about how you might use environmental impact analysis a little bit better? One of the things, going back to the mayor's comments about doing a bottom-up analysis of what you've got, under the state environmental law regulations, you're allowed to have your own local type 2 list. And if you put something on a type 2 list, you take it off of the SECRA table. It no longer needs to be reviewed under SECRA because type 2 actions are deemed to be to not have a negative impact on the environment. So if you did do something like the model ordinance and you had a development that wasn't going to have a negative water budget, or you do have a critical environmental area and you've got a development that's outside of the critical environmental area, and you want to save time and money and move something like an affordable housing development forward, you could use those techniques to create a type 2 list that exempts projects from seeker. Another technique that some municipalities use is a pre-application process. One of the people we trained years and years ago under our leadership training program came up with the idea of doing a mediated pre-application process with an applicant who was going to do mining in the town, and opened it up for kind of an ex-cathedral conversation with the neighbors and other stakeholders. And before the application was actually formally filed, they identified 5 negative environmental impacts that they thought the developer was going to have, and it gave the mining operator a chance to say, we can fix those problems. We have ways we can keep those things from happening by agreeing not to mine in this particular place, agreeing not to mine during certain hours, so we don't have so much using other methods to constrain the dust. We can add to our application those conditions before we ever submit the application. And that process worked its way through. And when the project was analyzed by the planning board, which this training graduate of ours was the chair, they negged it because it came in with no negative environmental impacts. They were able to say, this is not going to have environmental impacts on the community, therefore it's going to allow us to classify it, not to classify it, but to do a negative declaration or a neg deck stating that it's not going to have an impact on the environment. And that then stopped the seeker process and allowed the project to go forward. So there's lots of ways you can respect the private sector, respect economics of development, do area-wide analyses that then relate back to strengthen or the use of seeker or exempt projects from the use of seeker. You know, your planning board and your well, your planning board, if it's doing special use permitting, or if it's doing subdivision or site plan approvals, can only impose conditions that they're authorized under your subdivision or site plan regulations to impose. What the state law does is to broaden the scope of conditions to include everything. If you've ever read the definition of environment in the seeker law or in the regulations, it includes everything, including community character and anthropological, historical, cultural, scenic, all kinds of things that we never put in our subdivision requirements. So we wouldn't have to amend the subdivision regulations to create that beveled curb situation to prevent the turtles from dying in the trough, but just impose that condition under seeker because it's a way of mitigating a negative environmental impact. Any hands raised?
Nope.
Nope. So we've pretty well covered critical environmental areas under seeker. That's where you get your authority to do them. I don't know, Neil, if you wanted to, or Stan, if you wanted to talk about the particular circumstances of a few of the areas that you're thinking of designating as critical environmental areas.
Yeah, I don't have in front of me what all of the CEAs were. Neil would be more the person to talk to at this point because I've been off of that for at least 6 months. But I believe what they're doing is that the town is looking at how things go with the first one and then going to add others subsequently. I know that when I was on the planning board, that other planning board members felt it was too much all at once and were concerned. So I think that's kind of where that approach came from, as far as just slowing the roll down and not doing everything all at once. And but the amount of work that went into it was amazing. And all that I learned when I was on the planning board from people who came to speak with us, really what I kept getting over and over again was that it was actually helpful to both the municipality and people who wanted to develop land. And I saw it as a win-win, and maybe I'm missing something, but you know, if people have the flag up ahead of time, you know, we're going to be doing this. This is, you know, this is something to keep mind of more so than you might otherwise. Then that's beneficial to everybody. But you know, I'm certain that it's, you know, that I could be missing things. But it really did when I heard other municipalities talk to us about it, and saw, you know, videos that were made from other municipalities talking about how great it was for them. I was just really eager for us to utilize it. And I think knowing Neil, that Neil is eager as well. He's just being prudent and trying to, along with the rest of the board, help it to maybe ease us in more and just get a little more information from the first one before they keep going.
And Neil has his hand raised.
Yes, if I could share the screen, I can show you the map of what was proposed and talk a little bit about it. So I don't know if everyone can see this. It's a little bit large. I don't know if I can.
If I'm wrong, Neil, the biggest concern with it was so much of the area of our town that was a huge concern for people.
Yeah, so you know, this is the map right here. Hopefully it did change a bit, but this was the one I was able to pull up pretty quickly. So you see on the western side of the map, that's the Shungum Ridge. You know, so originally they proposed 6 of these areas as CEAs: the Shungum Ridge, the Wallkill, Kleinkill corridor, Clearwater Woods, the Plutarch Woods and wetlands, and the Swartakill wetlands, and then the Stonykill wetlands. Some of the concerns were that It was too much all at once, going from 0 to 6. That was going to be a significant portion of the town. So I think what the town board wants to do is focus on the Shungum Ridge, which is the green area to the west. Everyone around here agrees that the ridge is a critically important area. It's also, I think you can see, maybe not, if my map, but our water village reservoirs are right in the middle of this, so it will help with source water protection. The criticism is that this is already pretty protected, and so there may not be a lot of development. But if nothing happens over the next couple of years, then maybe we'll start with another one to kind of see how that goes. And so I think the next one, I think at least for us, for me anyway, there's this Plutarch Woods wetlands that is a nationally recognized important area for connectedness for habitats. And then also the Swartikill wetlands, the orange area. We haven't had a lot of development there, but I think in the future, we're going to start seeing more development. And so these are the areas, we're hoping to move forward on this Shungum Ridge, probably at our meeting, maybe Thursday, in 2 days from now. And past that, we've been working with Victoria Polidoro, who I'm sure many of you know. She's a well-recognized, I think, graduate of Pace Law School. She has kind of walked us through this and done a really phenomenal job with it. And so hopefully we'll do the ridge and then kind of move forward and protect some other areas soon. And, I think that for me, politically, yes. Environmentally, I think these are really important. Politically, because I'm kind of wearing both hats, you got to kind of ease people into doing the right thing. So that's why we're taking a slower approach. Because as you know, these can be overturned, just like a regular law can be overturned. You could have a public hearing and you could do away with the CEAs. And so I want to make sure people are comfortable and like these. And so another board doesn't come in and say, you know what, this is not good for the town, and then they get rid of it. I think that's my kind of feeling on this, but that's all I have to really say about it.
Could you walk us through the yellow, blue, purple, and
the blue is the Wallkill Kleinkill corridor. I mean, that's also an area that I think it's good for as a wildlife corridor. It connects the Plutarch Woods up to the ridge. A lot of that is already in the floodway, so there are significant protections against it already, and so that has a kind of a lower priority for us. And then the last one, the Stony Kill, there's a lot of farmland over there, and it's still a pretty good portion of open space. And I'm off the top of my head, I'm not as familiar with that, but so and the Swartikill wetlands is important. The Watershed Association did a bunch of studies. The Wallkill Watershed Association did a bunch of studies looking at subwatersheds for the Wallkill, and Swartikill is the least developed of all the subwatersheds for the Wallkill watershed, and also has the lowest nutrient concentrations. It's the most intact wetlands for the Wallkill, and so that's why one of the reasons that has a high priority. And it's also fairly large wetland complex that is, good for wildlife habitat. It doesn't have as much development pressure right now, but the worry is that it will, and that it probably needs more protection than what it has. We don't want that to be cut up with like single lot subdivisions either, and have those impact the water quality.
Before you take this down, let's use it as a prop for another topic. Unless there are additional things you'd like to say, Neil, or anybody else.
No, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't. I should have prepared more for this. We have some experts, Ingrid Hakel, who works for the DEC, helped do this, and she could speak a lot more knowledgeably on this than I could, so I apologize.
This is a wonderful thing about being a land use law professor, because we get to play with one of the most robust land use legal systems in the country, and there's all kinds of things you could do with this map. You have chosen one tool which comes to us out of SECR. So New York State is one of, I think, 12 states that has a little mini NEPA, environmental impact study requirement for local governments. And you've chosen to use a critical environmental area tool brought to us through SECR, which is terrific and does all the things that you're talking about doing. But essentially what it does is require every development that takes place on any plot of land in those areas that are designated as critical environmental areas by the town board. It requires a much closer look at the environmental impact during the review and approval process, so that you can come in and know, as Donna said, you can come in and know what you're going to have to put up with if you're a developer. Another approach to this same problem could be to use what we call overlay zoning, which is a different technique that operates differently, but accomplishes a lot of the same objectives. So in the Western critical environmental area of Greenland, that could be designated a overlay zone to protect it's probably the underlying zoning over there is mostly single family, large lot, but maybe there's, all right.
Yeah, a lot of it's already preserved, which is one of the criticisms of it. But I think the impetus for protecting it is it's the ridge, and it's a long protected area almost throughout the whole county now. Also, but then locally, people that maybe don't recognize the value of the habitat, but they value the visual aspects of it, right? And so, are you going to see? They don't want to see houses pop up and be scattered all over the ridge. So, we're lucky in that people see it wherever they are in town, and they value it because of the visual aspects, but the wildlife gets protected because of that. And
there are all kinds of sedimentation and erosion issues up there, and there's all kinds of other visual issues, and there's bird habitat issues, and it's kind of, some people call those ridge lines vertical ecosystems that have all kinds of functions that we don't think about. And when you put this in the hands of a planning board, if it's well advised by a conservation board, for example, all those good people that know the environment locally, then they can say, okay, we want to protect this particular element of the ecosystem in this critical environmental area. We studied it, we pointed it out, now we're going to impose a condition on you so that those bird habitats are not interrupted, or so that the developments are placed below the tree line, or whatever condition they want to impose. Contrast that to calling this an overlay zone. If you were to adopt an overlay zone over this green area, you would, in the overlay zone itself, you would say local zoning, the underlying zoning still applies. You can still only do a single family house on that 2-acre lot or 5-acre lot. And you have to follow all the subdivision regulations and the site plan regulations. But in addition to that, we're going to come up with 15 additional standards that are designed to protect the public, the specific ecosystem functions of this area. So now when you come in as an applicant, it's not in the discretion of the planning board any longer to impose those conditions. It's required to meet the standards of the overlay zone. Let me stop there to be sure that that difference is clear. Any questions about that?
I think that's what Gardner did, the town immediately to the south of us. And that was one of the suggestions that at least one of the consultants for our planning board has made that, you know, the CEAs are good, but if you really want to, like what Tim was saying earlier, if you really want to protect something and you really want to make it rock solid, you have to put it in the code.
Yes, and an overlay district is codification of those standards. And you don't give away your environmental impact powers when you develop an overlay district. If there's an additional issue with a particular site that is going to have a negative impact on the environment, and you haven't codified the standard for that, you can impose it as a condition under the individual seeker analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think we'll keep that option open. We'll see how, if this doesn't do a good job, then we'll have to move on to something that is much more rigid, which is the overlay. So I appreciate, I'll look into that.
Well, and also going back to one of the concerns that Tim had when we were first talking about comprehensive plans, meaning $100,000 comprehensive plans. There are various costs associated with doing a critical environmental area and an overlay district. And to the extent that you can identify the environmental characteristics that you're trying to protect and then come up with the standards that protect them, to the extent that that costs money, the more specific the analysis is, and the more specific the standards are, the better these things work down the road. So you can draw a line around that green area and articulate a few things that people know about its ecosystem and call it a critical environmental area, or you can pull out your natural resource inventory and expand it, update it, and include that in the adoption so that you're much more specific and giving better notice to people who want to develop land up there, what they have to deal with when they come in for planning board approval.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're very lucky, right, in New Paltz, in that we have, I think, I mean, the consultants that we bring in to help us are often amazed that, like, our volunteers are actually, you know, more of an expert than they are. You know, we have a lot of people like who work at the DEC who volunteer on our boards, and so I think we've done a really good job of that with the CEAs. I think that's never been a criticism of the CEA proposals that were put forward. You know, I think we got probably, I can't even imagine, tens of thousands of dollars of basically free consulting work because of the expert volunteers. But it is good to, I think, point that out. You know, once again, I think in New Paltz, it's harder for other towns. You know, when I've talked to other supervisors, they're like, how did you guys do that with volunteers? And I'm like, well, we're lucky. We have a university here and we have the DEC here. We have a lot of people who are experts on all different things. So
We have a raised hand.
I will say, with that being said, it is often hard for us to find enough people to do the volunteer work we need, but yes, we do have amazing volunteers.
This is Tim. So the question I have about like a map like this, and we've seen it other times. I remember looking at a map at an area that we protected some time ago, and the volunteers had identified areas, and I think at one point it was just like, okay, well, here's an area that's considered an area that should be protected because of biodiversity, and then there was like a circle within that area, and it said like, this is the core area for biodiversity. And then like, even like looking at this map, like you could see, you know, there's like color on one side of a property and white on another side of the property. So I think what's interesting is like what's going on between that white section and that colored section. What if I'm straddling those areas? Like I feel like in some ways it opens up questions that are hard to respond to in terms of, you know, someone who might be a property owner and saying, well, like, well, how come part of my property is this and part of it's that? Like, how do we respond to concerns or questions about like where these lines are drawn and how much science was used to you know, paint this part of my property red versus white?
Well, I think,
Probably, go ahead, Neil.
I mean, I always say that, you know, the problem is science was used to design this map. Science was not designed to set your property line. That was based on, you know, economics or whatever, wherever you wanted or someone wanted it to be. You know, the habitat may span your property. You know, we have grass in some parts of our yard and trees in other parts, and people have streams that run through their properties. Like, it is what it is, right? And we should do a better job of setting the zoning along property lines, and like, that's a fair criticism, but these maps are determined by science, maybe not down to, you know, on a meter by meter basis, but I think what these CEAs then require you to do is do a more in-depth. It may be that, like, just like when you look at the county parcel viewer, it may say that you have wetlands on your property, but then when you actually have it mapped out on a finer scale, it turns out that those wetlands aren't everywhere. They're just in certain areas. I think it's probably analogous to, you know, looking at the parcel viewer for the wetland map versus bringing in a wetland inspector to do a much more detailed map. That's how I would answer the question.
There's another dimension to that that really repeats the point. We found a town in Dutchess County, the town of Clinton, that actually developed a zoning district by scientific principles. It was, and one of the nice things about watersheds is that it's scientifically possible to decide where the water is coming from that sheds into the surface water. For example, this community had 2 ponds that it wanted to protect, and it drew a line around the watershed to the 2 ponds. And from an aerial perspective, what it looked like was a big amoeba. It was the strangest zoning district I'd ever seen. But the idea occurred to somebody in that particular town that we don't need to do an overlay zone. We don't need to do a critical environmental area. Let's just draw a district, a zoning district line to respect the edges of the watershed. And that became the zoning district. And within that zoning district, then all properties were regulated. If you had, Mayor, if you had a piece of property that was on one side of the watershed and had land that was outside the watershed, then those would be regulated separately under the planning board's approval process. But the zoning would specify the protections that are needed for the watershed itself, so that there's all kinds of different techniques you can use with proper science to avoid those things. And if you don't do it, then the answer, Tim, is that you can get reversed in court. If you don't do this carefully, then you're subject to what lawyers call a due process violation. You could have somebody claim that it's arbitrary and unreasonable to have my property divided in this way. And if you can't show the science behind it, if you can't prove the facts, then it can be argued to be arbitrary, and we don't hold our property subject to arbitrary regulation. That is called a due process violation. And you can lose lawsuits if you don't do it right. So your caution is a good one. And Neil's emphasis on science is really the appropriate answer. How are we doing? Is there time for a joke? So this supervisor was speeding through the adjacent village and got pulled over by a young patrolman who said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but you were speeding at a considerable rate here, and I'm going to have to ask you for your driver's license." And the supervisor said, I don't have a driver's license. It was taken for driving under the influence. And this little cop says, "Well, then show me your registration." And the supervisor said, "I don't have a registration for this car. I stole it." What? The patrolman says, well, what's going on here? And he said, "Well, if you want to know, the owner of the car is in a gunny sack in the trunk of the car." So the young patrolman calls the chief of police, and these 3 squad cars come within minutes. And the chief of police walks up to the supervisor and says, "My young patrolman here says that you don't have a driver's license." And the supervisor reaches in his pocket and hands him the driver's license. And the chief of police says, "Well, my young officer told me that you didn't have registration for this vehicle." And the supervisor reaches over to the glove compartment, pulls out the registration, shows it to him. And the poor police chief is so worried now. And he says, "Could you just pop the trunk and let me check. And so the supervisor pops the trunk and the police chief goes back and sees nothing but a spare tire and a wrench and comes back and he says, "I am so sorry. My young officer told me that you didn't have a driver's license. You didn't have a registration. There was evidence of criminality in the trunk." And the supervisor said, "Yeah, I'll bet the young officer also told you that I was speeding." So that's the story of the clever supervisor from whom we just heard some very clever thoughts about CEAs. All right. I'll just kind of cherry pick a few things as we move toward the end of this presentation. In your open space protection, again, let's pull back that whole idea of a conservation advisory committee, conservation board, natural resource inventory. You can actually adopt regulations that require that landowners deduct environmentally sensitive acres from the lot sizes to reduce the number of residences permitted, as well as to do good things like reducing runoff and erosion. So you can use your environmental sensitive areas that you've designated. And again, going back to the mayor's concerns, this has to be science-based and not arbitrary and not unreasonable. But if you do that, you can say you own 100 acres, 40 of them are environmentally sensitive. You only have 60 acres that you can use to create your density count. So if it's 2 acres only, you can only do 30 tops, as long as you can show where they go in environmentally sensitive ways. So deducting environmentally sensitive areas, which are in the NRI or the Open Space Protection Plan, maybe a good thing that you want to know about. Okay. Do you all know that you can adopt your own wetlands ordinances in New York State? We think of the Army Corps of Engineers and DEC as the wetland regulators of freshwater wetlands. But again, New York state law is very aggressive. I think DEC's jurisdiction over wetlands is for 12.4 acres or larger wetlands of that size. And there are a lot of environmentalists that think that wetlands of much smaller sizes should be protected. There's a whole play going on right now in the federal law of what is water bodies that are subject to federal regulation. They call it WOTUS, Waters of the United States. And WOTUS under Clinton meant one thing, under Obama meant something else, and under Trump meant something else, and now under Biden is being reversed to what it was under Obama. But there are things that are like vernal wetlands, transient wetlands that are much smaller than 12.4 acres and maybe don't prove out as wetlands quite as scientifically as DEC's wetlands do. These are within the power of local governments. You can regulate half-acre wetlands. You can regulate transient wetlands. You can regulate vernal pools of small sizes where the state and federal governments may be unable to do that. So I think that you said that you have in one of your communities a wetlands ordinance, or do both?
I'm not sure. I'll have to look. I'm pretty sure we do in New Paltz, but I know we have a something, but I can't speak on it. Sorry.
Mayor, this is one of those situations where if in your bottom-up review, you said, let's just take a look at wetlands regulations. There are people like our students can do this. A lot of people do this. Where are there wetlands ordinances that we can look at? Jenny, do you want to mention the database that you've created?
Well, we have our gaining ground information database that's available on the Land Use Law Center's website that has just sort of an endless number of local ordinances for every topic. It's searchable by community name, it's searchable by a whole bunch of different factors, but especially by topic. And so if there's something specific that you want to know about, like wetlands protection or steep slopes or anything like that, all of those topics are listed on the database, and you can just click on that and it'll pull up all of the local examples that we have posted there over the years, for you to take a look at what communities have done.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I just wasn't thinking right. We do have a wetland law in New Paltz. It gives people the right to have the town pay for a wetland inspector to come and inspect their property when they have an application for the planning board. And that helps bring people into compliance. I'm not sure if we have reduced the size of the wetlands, but we do have a lot of rules regulating development on wetlands. And we have a steep slope law as well.
Okay. Well, I don't know how many, I'm going back to where we started because I'm trying to make this training program as relevant to the circumstances in your communities as possible. But just to go back to that initial thought that evolved after the mayor spoke, if you're doing a bottom-up analysis and somebody who is engaged in it said, let's look and see what we do for wetlands, and you are not comfortable that you're doing enough or the best, it doesn't take a lot of effort to go on Jenny's website and find 2 or 3 other wetlands laws and take a look at them and say, what do they do? How do they operate? Do we want to adopt this here? Right, you can probably do that for 10 or 15 things without great expense. And if you can limit yourself to 10 or 15 things and protect the watershed, that's a pretty feasible politically and also financially approach to comprehensive planning. Anybody else want to add anything about wetlands? You can, in your subdivision site plan and special use permitting standards, you can protect wetland functions. You can do that under State Environmental Quality Review Act as a lead agency if anything is going to affect negatively a wetland. Even without wetlands regulations, you can impose conditions on the development that mitigate the negative impact on the wetlands. There's no excuse for not protecting wetlands under New York state law. Unless there are questions on this topic, we'll go to the remaining topic 15 minutes ahead of time, which makes up for the jokes.